Nearly every human species that once walked the earth eventually disappeared. Homo erectus disappeared too, but only after surviving for almost 2 million years, far longer than our own species has existed. Continents changed, climates shifted, and other human lineages came and went, yet generation after generation endured. Much of what allowed them to persist vanished when they did. So what did they possess that later humans may have lost? And how did Homo erectus survive for 2 million years? 2 million years is a length of time that the human mind does not easily hold. We are used to measuring history in generations, kingdoms, wars, migrations, and the rise and fall of cities. Even 10,000 years feels remote because it reaches back beyond writing, farming, and permanent settlements. Yet the story of Homo erectus stretches far deeper than that. The earliest fossils generally placed within this long human lineage appeared close to 2 million years ago, while some of the latest known remains survived until a much later period in the Pleistocene. This does not mean one unchanging population endured in the same place for the entire span. It means that many related populations, separated by distance and time, carried recognizable features through an immense sequence of generations. To understand the scale, consider that our own species has existed for only a small fraction of that interval. Agriculture occupies an even thinner layer near the surface of the past. Cities, states, writing, and recorded history belong to a final moment so brief that beside the duration of Homo erectus, they appear almost like a late flicker. Entire mountain valleys changed. Rivers shifted their courses. Lakes formed and vanished. Grasslands expanded. Forests returned. And coastlines moved as climates repeatedly cooled and warmed. Through these changes, populations associated with Homo erectus appeared across regions of Africa and Asia, not as a single marching people, but as communities living, moving, reproducing, and disappearing in different regions. Their survival was therefore not a continuous victory. Local groups must have failed many times. Some areas were abandoned. Some populations may have become isolated. Others may have expanded when food, water, or open land became available. The larger lineage continued because extinction in one place did not always mean extinction everywhere. This distinction matters. When we say Homo erectus survived for nearly 2 million years, we are not describing a stable civilization guarding the same knowledge. There were no archives to preserve memory across that whole interval, no written names, and no central society connecting the beginning to the end. What endured was biological inheritance joined to learned behavior, passed from parents and companions to younger individuals, then altered under new conditions. A useful method of making this time visible is to imagine all recorded human history compressed into the final seconds of a long night. The first villages would arrive only near dawn. Homo sapiens would enter much earlier, but Homo erectus would already have occupied most of the darkness. This comparison does not make them primitive or superior. It simply reveals how misleading our normal sense of duration can be. Technological complexity is not the same as evolutionary endurance. A species can build little that survives in the ground and still remain present for an extraordinary period. It can also possess remarkable technology and yet face dangers that no invention fully removes. The longevity of Homo erectus invites a quieter question than the usual search for a single breakthrough. Perhaps their persistence depended not on one discovery, but on a continuing balance between body, movement, diet, social learning, population spread, and changing landscapes. None of these factors alone explains the full span. The first step is only to recognize what that span truly means. The significance lies in repetition across countless ordinary lives. Each generation had to find water again, recognize useful stone again, protect children again, and learn the routes that made survival possible. Nothing was guaranteed by the success of earlier ancestors. Knowledge could be lost, environments could close, and small groups could vanish. Longevity emerged only when enough generations repeatedly solved immediate problems without knowing that their descendants would continue the pattern across ages beyond comprehension. Homo erectus did not stand outside history for 2 million years. They lived through a history so long that almost all of it disappeared without words, leaving stone, bone, and scattered traces behind. Homo erectus reaches us without a voice, a name, or a complete body. What remains are bones, teeth, stone tools, and layers of earth whose positions must be carefully studied. From these traces, researchers try to decide which fossils belong together and which differences may reflect age, sex, geography, or evolutionary change. A skull found in Java may be separated by thousands of kilometers and hundreds of thousands of years from a jaw found in Africa. Even when two fossils resemble one another, they were not necessarily members of the same population. The label Homo erectus is therefore not a tag attached to an obvious figure. It is a scientific judgment built from comparisons. Many fossils assigned to this lineage share a long, low brain case, brow ridges, cranial bones, and a face shaped differently from that of Homo sapiens. Teeth and jaws also provide clues, although no single feature can identify every individual with certainty. Researchers examine combinations of traits, because evolution does not produce neat boundaries that can always be seen in one bone. The shape of a skull can change through growth, and bodies can vary within a species. Fossilization adds another difficulty. Pressure can distort bone, erosion can remove edges, and excavation may recover only a fragment. The beginning of this human lineage must therefore be reconstructed from evidence that is both valuable and incomplete. Dating the surrounding sediments helps place each fossil in time, while volcanic layers, magnetic signals, and associated animal remains may provide guidance. Yet a date does not identify a species by itself. Anatomy, geological context, and comparison must be considered together. This is why the scientific picture can change when a new fossil is found, or when an older specimen is studied with better imaging. One of the debates concerns the early African fossils, often called Homo ergaster. Some researchers use that name for African individuals with certain features that appear somewhat different from the classic fossils discovered in Eastern and Southeastern Asia. Under this view, Homo ergaster was a related African form, while Homo erectus in a narrower sense belonged mainly to Asia. Other researchers prefer a broader definition and place many African and Eurasian fossils within a widespread variable Homo erectus lineage. Neither choice means that one side has ignored the bones. The disagreement reflects a deeper problem in studying extinct humans. A species is normally understood through living populations, reproduction, inherited variation, and genetic relationships. For fossils nearly 2 million years old, those forms of evidence are rarely available. Scientists must infer biological boundaries from anatomy preserved across enormous distances and spans of time. Dmanisi, in present-day Georgia, made this problem especially clear. Several early human skulls from one location display considerable variation, showing that individuals living in the same region could look different. That discovery cautions against naming a new species whenever two skulls fail to match closely. It does not prove that every early human belonged to one species, but it demonstrates how broad variation can be within a population. The long history of Homo erectus makes classification even harder. A lineage lasting across many climatic cycles would not remain physically identical. Populations became separated, adapted to local conditions, and accumulated differences over generations. The humans near the origin of the lineage in Africa need not have looked exactly like those living much later on Java. The name can be useful without implying perfect uniformity. It gathers fossils that appear to share a broad evolutionary pattern while leaving room for uncertainty at the edges. This careful uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the reason the story can remain honest. Homo erectus was not discovered as a complete answer buried in the ground. The lineage was assembled slowly from pieces, and every piece must be tested against the others before it can deepen our understanding of how such ancient humans began and endured. The endurance of Homo erectus creates a paradox. Modern people measure success through accumulation. We notice buildings that remain, tools that become more complex, records that preserve memory, and institutions that survive beyond a single lifetime. By those standards, Homo erectus left little that resembles civilization. There were no cities, no writing, no metal, no agriculture, and no known system capable of carrying detailed information across thousands of generations. Yet the lineage persisted through a span so long that every empire in recorded history would fit inside a small fraction of it. This does not mean Homo erectus was more advanced than later humans, and it does not mean progress is useless. It means that evolutionary survival follows a different measure. A population does not remain on Earth because it produces the most impressive objects. It remains because enough individuals continue to reproduce, move, learn, and adjust while conditions change around them. The beginning of Homo erectus lay in a world without the protections that later societies created. Food could not be stored on an industrial scale. Water systems could fail without warning. Injuries, disease, predators, and seasonal scarcity could remove individuals quickly. Every generation began again, with bodies that needed warmth, calories, shelter, and social support. Nothing about this life was easy. Long survival should not be mistaken for comfort. It was probably made from repeated recoveries after losses that left no visible record. A group could disappear from one valley while another endured beside a distant lake. A useful stone source could be abandoned. A familiar route could close as rainfall shifted. The lineage continued not because every group succeeded, but because failure was distributed across a wide and changing world. This may be one reason the title of their story is so difficult to answer with a single invention. A city can fall on a known date. A dynasty can end with a named ruler. A species fades through population decline, separation, replacement, and environmental change, often across intervals too long for a simple event. The same is true of survival. Nearly 2 million years cannot be explained by one moment of intelligence or one perfect adaptation. Any useful trait had to remain useful under changing conditions, or be joined by other forms of flexibility when the environment moved beyond its limits. The origin of this long human lineage therefore matters as much as its later spread. Homo erectus emerged from earlier human populations already shaped by upright walking, tool use, social dependence, and changing diets. They did not begin from nothing. Their endurance may have rested on inherited foundations that were gradually reorganized rather than suddenly invented. A body suited to longer travel could open new landscapes, but it also demanded more energy. A larger brain could support more complex behavior, but it was costly to grow and maintain. Stone tools could extend the hand, but only where suitable stone and learned skill were available. Living in groups could offer protection, yet groups also required cooperation and access to enough food. Every advantage carried a burden. Their world did not reward permanence as later societies would. Camps could be temporary, tools discarded, and knowledge could live only in practiced hands. What mattered was not whether a place remembered them, but whether younger individuals learned enough to survive after older ones were gone and landscapes had changed again. This balance prevents us from turning Homo erectus into a symbol of perfect adaptation. They survived for an extraordinary time, but they were never beyond danger. Their long presence may instead reveal the strength of being adequate in many different ways rather than dominant in only one. The paradox remains open. If survival does not always belong to the species with the richest technology or the greatest control, the unanswered question is what allowed generation after generation of Homo erectus to continue when so many other human lineages disappeared. When Homo erectus first appeared in Africa, the land around them was not a single endless grassland beneath a permanently dry sky. Eastern Africa near the beginning of the Pleistocene contained a shifting mosaic of lakes, marshes, rivers, wooded patches, open plains, volcanic ground, and drier country. These habitats did not remain fixed. Rainfall changed across long cycles, lakes expanded and contracted, and plant communities moved as temperatures and moisture altered. A place that offered water, shade, edible plants, and grazing animals for several generations could later become less dependable. Another basin might become richer at the same time. The earliest populations associated with Homo erectus therefore emerged inside landscapes defined not only by difficulty, but by repeated rearrangement. The East African Rift helped create much of this variety. Faulting and volcanic activity formed basins where water could collect, while highlands, valleys, and changing drainage patterns placed different environments close together. Fossil animals, ancient soils, plant remains, and chemical signals preserved in sediments show that early humans did not inhabit one uniform setting. Some sites indicate open grassland. Others preserve woodland, bushland, wetlands, or mixtures of several habitats. The familiar image of a lone ancestor walking across an empty savanna is useful only if it is treated as one moment within a larger and less stable world. Open country was spreading in many areas, yet trees and water continued to shape where animals gathered and where humans could survive. Climate change did not operate like a door that opened once and produced Homo erectus. There is no simple line from drying grasslands to a new human form. Environmental changes occurred at different speeds and with different effects across the continent. Some were gradual enough to unfold beyond a single lifetime. Others may have been felt through failed rains, shrinking water sources, altered animal movements, or the loss of familiar vegetation. The origin of Homo erectus took place against this background of uncertainty, where inherited ways of finding food could remain useful in one location but become less effective in another. A population tied too closely to one narrow habitat would have been vulnerable when that habitat contracted. Yet flexibility should not be imagined as complete freedom. Early humans still depended on fresh water, sufficient calories, usable stone, tolerable temperatures, and social groups capable of raising young. They could not simply choose any landscape. Their movements were limited by bodies, distance, predators, illness, and the uneven distribution of resources. Lakes and river margins may have offered concentrated opportunities, but they also changed. Marshes could dry, floods could reshape banks, herds could shift their routes, wooded areas could thin, while new grasslands appeared elsewhere. Survival meant responding to these changes over generations rather than mastering them. The animals around Homo erectus were also living through the same unstable conditions. Grazers, browsers, carnivores, scavengers, and smaller creatures entered or left local environments as vegetation changed. Human access to meat, marrow, roots, fruits, seeds, and other foods would have varied with these ecological movements. The first Homo erectus populations existed within a larger community of life, not rulers standing above it. Their beginning may be understood as the emergence of a human body and way of living that could function across more than one local setting, though the extent of that flexibility remains a matter for careful evidence. What mattered was not an ability to predict distant climate cycles. It was the repeated capacity to locate water, follow changing opportunities, and preserve enough learned behavior for younger generations. Across enough generations, differences in route choice, food gathering, cooperation, and tolerance of changing ground could shape which groups endured. The landscape selected no perfect response, only responses sufficient for the conditions confronting each population at that time. The unstable Africa, into which Homo erectus was born, did not offer a permanent home. It offered many temporary ones, each requiring attention, movement, and adjustment over time. The appearance of Homo erectus did not empty Africa of every earlier human form. Near the beginning of this lineage, the continent still supported several kinds of hominins whose bodies, teeth, and feeding strategies reflected different evolutionary histories. Fossils assigned to early Homo lived during overlapping periods with robust australopiths such as Paranthropus, and possibly with more than one form of the genus Homo. The boundaries between some of these groups remain debated, but the larger picture is clear. Human evolution was not a straight procession in which one species stepped forward only after another had vanished. It resembled a branching landscape, with related populations occupying different ecological spaces at the same time. In eastern Africa, Homo erectus could have encountered environments also used by Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and Paranthropus boisei. In southern Africa, fossil evidence likewise indicates that Homo erectus appeared while other hominin lineages were still present. These names should not be imagined as separate nations with fixed territories. They are scientific categories applied to fossils, and living populations may have overlapped, avoided one another, or used the same places at different times. Archaeology rarely preserves enough detail to show a meeting between individuals. Even fossils found within the same broad layer do not always prove that their owners stood together on the same day. Yet discoveries of different hominin remains in closely related deposits show that the world of early Homo erectus contained more human diversity than the world today. At some ancient lakesides, footprints and fossils suggest that distinct hominin bodies used the same landscapes within narrow intervals of geological time. Such evidence cannot reveal whether they watched, feared, ignored, or competed with one another, but it confirms that human diversity was once an ordinary condition, This matters because survival was shaped by more than climate and predators. Other hominins also needed water, edible plants, animal remains, shelter, and stone. Their diets were not necessarily identical, and anatomy suggests that some relied more heavily on particular foods than others. Paranthropus possessed powerful jaws and large back teeth suited to intensive chewing, although its actual diet was probably more flexible than those features once suggested. Early Homo generally had different teeth and faces, while Homo erectus developed a larger body and a form increasingly suited to long movement on the ground. These differences may have reduced direct competition in some settings, but they would not have removed it. During drought or local scarcity, many animals and hominins could be drawn toward the same remaining water and food. The origin of Homo erectus, therefore, occurred within an ecological test shared by close relatives, not on an open stage waiting for a single winner. Its early persistence does not prove immediate superiority. Some other lineages continued for long periods after Homo erectus appeared. Different bodies could remain successful under different conditions, and a trait valuable in open country might offer less advantage near woodland or wetlands. Evolution did not compare every species and select one permanent champion. Local populations endured while their inherited bodies and learned behaviors remained sufficient for particular surroundings. Over time, the fossil record of several earlier lineages ends, while Homo erectus spreads across a wider geographical range. That pattern invites explanations involving mobility, diet, body size, social learning, and the capacity to use varied landscapes. It does not show that Homo erectus deliberately displaced every neighbor or caused every extinction. Climate changes, small populations, habitat shifts, and ordinary demographic chance may all have contributed to the disappearance of other groups. The beginning of this long-lived lineage was therefore not a sudden human takeover. It was one branch among several, sharing Africa with distant cousins whose lives are known only through scattered remains. Its later expansion becomes more meaningful when we remember that Homo erectus first had to survive in a crowded evolutionary world, where being human was not yet represented by only one form. The earliest Homo erectus populations were not simply earlier humans with larger skulls. Their bodies also reveal a major change in how life could be carried across the landscape. Fossils from Africa, especially the incomplete skeleton often called the Nario-Kotome youth, show a body with long legs, relatively shorter arms, and proportions that were closer to those of later humans than to the smaller-bodied hominins that came before. The skeleton belonged to a young individual, so any reconstruction of adult height requires caution, but the general pattern is clear. Homo erectus had become more fully committed to life on the ground. Upright walking was already ancient by the time this lineage appeared. Earlier hominins had moved on two legs for millions of years, and Homo erectus did not invent bipedalism. What changed was the arrangement of the body around that inherited form of movement. Longer lower limbs could support a longer stride. Shorter arms reduced the climbing proportions seen more strongly in some earlier hominins. The pelvis, spine, feet, and legs together suggest habitual terrestrial travel, although no fossil can tell us exactly how far one individual walked during an ordinary day. This body did not guarantee migration, endurance, or survival. It created possibilities that depended on food, water, health, terrain, and learned decisions. A longer stride may have reduced the effort required to cross open ground, but larger bodies also demanded more energy. Greater height could improve the ability to see across grass and brush, yet it could also expose the body to heat and increase the amount of water needed. Every anatomical shift carried both an opportunity and a cost. The beginning of Homo erectus must therefore be understood as a new balance rather than a perfect design. The chest may not have had the narrow, barrel-shaped form once imagined from incomplete reconstructions. Work on the ribs of the Nario-Kotome skeleton suggests a deeper and wider torso than that of many living humans. This reminder is important because the familiar modern human outline did not appear all at once. Some features were more human-like, while others remained different. Evolution assembled the body gradually, preserving useful structures and modifying them under changing conditions. Variation also existed among early populations. The individuals from Dmanisi had relatively small bodies, but their lower limbs still show proportions and joint structures suited to effective movement over distance. Homo erectus was therefore not one fixed body size spreading unchanged across the world. A shared ground-based pattern could exist within populations that differed in stature and anatomy. Living mainly on the ground altered daily risks. Trees could still provide food or temporary safety, but a body less specialized for climbing would rely more heavily on awareness, group presence, suitable resting places, and the ability to move between resources. On open terrain, water and food might be separated by distances that smaller, more climbing-adapted ancestors had encountered less often. The body of Homo erectus may have made those distances more manageable without making them harmless. Young individuals still had to learn where to go, when to stop, and how to remain near others. Bones alone cannot reveal those lessons, but anatomy shows the physical framework within which such learning occurred. This change connected the origin of Homo erectus to its later geographical spread. A lineage capable of efficient terrestrial walking possessed a body that could follow shifting lakeshores, animal routes, river valleys, and expanding grasslands across generations. No single journey explains the pattern, and no individual knew that distant descendants would reach other regions. Movement accumulated slowly as groups responded to nearby conditions. That wider range offered no certainty, but it gave populations more chances to endure when familiar habitats became unreliable or disappeared. The first transformation inside the body did not answer how Homo erectus survived for so long, but it widened the range of places where survival could be attempted. Long before maps, borders, or remembered journeys, early human populations began appearing beyond Africa, and one of the clearest windows into that movement lies at Dmanisi, in the southern Caucasus of present-day Georgia. The site preserves human fossils, simple stone tools, and animal remains dating to nearly 2 million years ago, placing early Homo far outside Africa, surprisingly close to the beginning of the broad lineage commonly called Homo erectus. This evidence changed an older expectation that humans could leave Africa only after developing very large brains, tall bodies, or highly elaborate technology, because the Dmanisi individuals had relatively small brains, varied body sizes, and tools made through comparatively simple methods. Their presence suggests that the ability to enter new regions did not wait for every feature associated with later humans to appear. Movement may instead have grown from ordinary decisions repeated over many generations, as groups followed nearby water, edible plants, animal concentrations, workable stone, and tolerable ground without possessing any image of a distant destination. No individual needed to imagine Eurasia, and no community had to announce that it was leaving a continent. A family might shift toward a neighboring valley during scarcity, descendants might remain there, and later generations could gradually extend the occupied landscape again. When such local changes accumulate across centuries, a distribution can expand far beyond the experience of any one life. Dmanisi stood within a region linking lands south of the Caucasus with valleys and plains farther north, but the route followed by early humans cannot be reconstructed as a single road. Coastlines, river systems, grasslands, and passages through higher ground changed with climate, while populations could advance, pause, retreat, or disappear. The fossils, therefore, record presence rather than a complete travel story. They show that early humans reached the Caucasus, but they do not reveal the exact point of departure, the number of movements, or whether every group belonged to precisely the same biological category. Some researchers place the Dmanisi people within a broadly defined Homo erectus, while others emphasize their mixture of earlier and later traits. That uncertainty does not weaken their importance, because whatever name is preferred, they demonstrate that a human form near the origin of the Homo erectus pattern was already capable of living beyond the African environments in which its deeper ancestry had developed. The animals found with them indicate a community unlike any single East African setting, and the climate included colder seasons than many equatorial regions. Survival there required responses to unfamiliar timing, vegetation, prey, and danger. Yet the archaeological record does not support a picture of triumphant explorers mastering the north. These populations remained vulnerable, using tools that would have been recognizable within older stone traditions and depending on local opportunities that could fail. Their expansion was important precisely because it did not require perfection. A lineage able to occupy another region gained more than territory. since geographical spread separated risks. Drought, disease, or ecological collapse in one area might destroy local groups without ending the entire lineage elsewhere. This would later become one possible foundation of the extraordinary duration associated with Homo erectus. Though expansion also divided populations and exposed them to new limits, distance could isolate communities, learned practices could be lost, and unfamiliar seasons could turn small mistakes into death. Leaving Africa was therefore neither a guaranteed success nor a single victorious event. It was a long demographic process made from births, deaths, short movements, and repeated adjustments near the edge of what each generation knew. Dmanisi preserves one early result of that process, a place where scattered bones show that the human world had already become wider, even though the people widening it could never have understood the immense journey. Their descendants and distant relatives were beginning and offering an early glimpse of the patient, uncertain expansion that would carry human populations across changing continents for ages to come. Water is the first limit on almost every movement across a dry landscape. Early Homo erectus could travel farther than many earlier hominins, but no body could cross endless ground without drinking, eating, resting, and finding shelter from heat or cold. Their expansion beyond Africa was therefore likely shaped by connected patches of usable habitat rather than by straight lines on an empty map. River valleys, lake margins, springs, wetlands, wooded corridors, and seasonally green plains could place essential resources within reach of one another. Where such places formed a chain, populations could move gradually while remaining close to water and food. Where deserts widened or mountain conditions became severe, movement may have slowed, reversed, or stopped. These routes were not permanent roads. Rainfall shifted, rivers changed course, lakes shrank, and vegetation moved with climate. A passage open to several generations could later close, leaving populations isolated on opposite sides of land that had become too dry or cold. The animals around early humans responded to the same changes. Grazing herds followed fresh vegetation, while other species remained near rivers, woodland, or permanent water. Homo erectus may sometimes have moved through landscapes where animal paths also indicated water, edible plants, scavenging opportunities, or places where prey gathered. This does not mean humans simply followed one herd from Africa into Asia. Different animals moved at different times, and humans required more than meat. Roots, fruits, seeds, insects, small animals, stone, shade, and safe resting ground all influence whether a location could support a group. The beginning of human expansion was therefore tied to whole ecological systems rather than one resource. River gravels could provide both water and stone suitable for cutting edges. Lake shores might attract animals and support plant foods, yet they could also contain dangerous predators and seasonal flooding. Open grassland could make distant movement easier, but it offered less shade. Wooded country could provide shelter and varied foods while making travel slower or visibility poorer. Each corridor contained benefits and limits, and no environment remained equally useful throughout the year. Younger individuals had to learn these changing relationships from those around them. A route was not valuable merely because it existed. It had to be remembered through repeated use, adjusted when conditions changed, and abandoned when its costs became too high. Archaeology cannot recover the names of these paths or the decisions made beside each water source. It can only show patterns of fossils, tools, sediments, and animals across regions. From those patterns, researchers infer that climate sometimes created windows in which wetter landscapes connected areas that were otherwise divided by aridity. Such windows did not force humans to move, and they did not guarantee that movement succeeded. They only widened the ground on which survival could be attempted. This distinction keeps the expansion of Homo erectus within the scale of ordinary life. No one needed a vision of another continent. A group needed only to reach the next dependable place. Children born there would begin from a new edge, and their descendants might later move again. Across hundreds or thousands of generations, these short relocations could carry human populations through northeastern Africa, western Asia, and farther into Eurasia. The same process could also fragment them, because a corridor that closed behind one population might prevent contact with groups elsewhere. Expansion created both opportunity and separation. It spread risk across distant regions, but it also placed communities in climates where familiar foods, seasons, and materials were altered. In this way, geography did not merely surround their story. It repeatedly narrowed and widened the choices available to bodies whose human ancestry had been shaped by dependence on movement, water, and shared learning. The routes of water and life did not lead toward a promised destination. They offered temporary openings, and Homo erectus survived only when enough generations could recognize those openings, use them, and continue before the landscape changed again. From the Caucasus, the record of early humans becomes wider and less complete. Stone tools, isolated teeth, skull fragments, and later, more substantial fossils appear across large regions of Asia. They do not trace one continuous trail, and they cannot show that a single population traveled from Western Asia to China and then to Java. Instead, they reveal separate moments when human groups were present in landscapes divided by mountains, dry basins, river systems, forests, and changing coastlines. By the early Pleistocene, humans had reached regions of Eastern Asia, including northern China and the island region that would later become Java. This distribution stretched across environments that could not have demanded exactly the same behavior. Northern China brought cold winters, strong seasonal winds, open ground, and periods when food availability changed sharply through the year. Farther south, warmer climates supported different plants and animals, while rainfall and humidity created other limits. Java lay within the tropical world of Southeast Asia, but it was not always separated from the mainland as it is today. During periods of lower sea level, broad areas of the Sunda Shelf became dry land connecting Java with areas of continental Asia. Rivers crossed this exposed landscape, and grasslands, woodlands, and animal communities shifted across it. Early humans could have entered through these changing terrestrial environments without crossing the deep ocean, although the exact routes, timing, and number of movements remain uncertain. Reaching Java did not mean entering a permanent tropical refuge. Volcanoes altered the ground, rivers moved, sea levels rose and fell, and vegetation changed between more open and more wooded conditions. A place rich in grazing animals during one interval could later become less suitable. In northern China, the challenge was different. Winter cold and seasonal scarcity required populations to remain where edible resources could still be found when plant growth slowed. Evidence of early occupation does not prove that every group stayed throughout every season. Some may have moved locally, returned when conditions improved, or disappeared entirely. The archaeological record preserves occupation, not a complete calendar of behavior. Stone also changed from region to region. A method learned where large, predictable blocks were available might need adjustment where useful material occurred only as small pebbles or poor quality fragments. Tools in Eastern Asia do not always resemble the large hand axes found at many African and Western Eurasian sites. This difference was once treated as evidence of a simple technological boundary, but available raw material, local tasks, preservation, and research history all complicate that picture. Homo erectus did not carry one fixed toolkit that remained identical across every continent. The deeper continuity may have been the ability to recognize what local stone could do, produce a cutting edge, and pass workable methods to younger members of the group. The same principle applied to food and movement. Animals familiar in one region disappeared from another. Plants ripened in different seasons. Water could be abundant during rains and difficult to reach during dry months. The human lineage that began in Africa was now repeatedly confronted by environments unlike the ones that had shaped its earliest generations. Its spread was therefore more than geographical distance. It was a long test of whether bodies, learned habits, and social dependence could remain useful after the surrounding world changed. Some populations clearly failed because occupation at many sites was interrupted. Others endured long enough to leave traces far from the lineage's origin. Each distant population became a separate experiment, vulnerable to losses its relatives could not prevent, yet sheltered from disasters those distant relatives could not reach, widening risks and chances across many future generations. Their presence across temperate and tropical Asia does not prove unlimited adaptability. It shows that Homo erectus could attempt survival under a wider range of conditions than many earlier hominins, turning local adjustment into a pattern that gradually covered an extraordinary portion of the ancient world. The legs of Homo erectus reveal one of the clearest changes in the long history of human movement. Earlier hominins had already walked upright, but many retained bodies that combined terrestrial walking with stronger climbing abilities, while fossils commonly assigned to Homo erectus show lower limbs that were relatively long and increasingly suited to carrying the body across the ground. The Nariokotome skeleton from East Africa preserves much of this pattern. Although it belonged to a young individual and cannot represent every population, its long femora and lower legs suggest a stride closer to that of later humans than to the shorter stepping pattern inferred for some earlier hominins. Fossils from Dmanisi also indicate effective upright walking despite smaller average body size, reminding us that efficient travel did not require one fixed height or a perfectly modern body. Longer legs can increase stride length and may reduce the energetic cost of covering a given distance, but bones do not tell us how many kilometers a group traveled on an ordinary day, provide a physical capacity, not a diary of behavior. Movement still depended on age, injury, pregnancy, childhood, available water, temperature, terrain, and the pace of companions. A group could travel only as effectively as its most vulnerable members allowed. Because children and injured adults could not simply be left outside the social world on which survival depended, the importance of long legs therefore lay not in speed alone, but in widening the area that could be searched without spending every available calorie on movement. Waterholes, stone sources, animal remains, plant foods, shade and resting places were rarely gathered in one permanent location. As rainfall changed, the distance between them could increase, turning a familiar landscape into a more demanding one. A body capable of economical walking could make such separations more manageable, giving populations additional choices when nearby resources failed. This may also have supported gradual expansion through river valleys, grasslands, and seasonal corridors, though it did not make every barrier passable. Mountains, deserts, dense forests, deep water, severe cold, and simple exhaustion still restricted movement. Some anatomical features of Homo erectus have also been discussed in relation to endurance running, including long legs and structures that may have helped stabilize the head and trunk. Running could have been useful in certain forms of hunting, scavenging, escape, or rapid travel, but the evidence does not show that every population regularly ran prey to exhaustion, or that running alone explains their survival. Walking was probably the more constant requirement, repeated during daily searches and seasonal relocations across thousands of generations. Its value would have appeared quietly through slightly lower costs, wider search ranges, and a greater chance of reaching water before conditions became dangerous. This connection reaches back to the origin of the lineage, when a larger ground-based body began to emerge within unstable African environments. The new proportions did not free Homo erectus from ecology. They tied survival more closely to movement by increasing energy needs while making broader movement possible. A larger traveller had to find more food, yet could search a larger landscape for it. The advantage existed only when knowledge guided the body toward useful places. Legs without remembered routes could carry a group farther into danger, while knowledge without sufficient mobility could become useless when a lake dried or vegetation shifted. Over deep time, anatomy and learning may have reinforced one another, allowing descendants to inherit both a body suited to terrestrial travel and practical information about when, where, and with whom to move. This mattered because the human starting point was no longer confined to nearby trees and familiar feeding patches, but extended across open spaces where survival depended on reaching scattered resources before conditions worsened. The endurance of Homo erectus was therefore not contained inside the bones, but those bones widened the distances over which each generation could attempt to survive. A body moving through open country must solve a quiet problem before it can search for food, follow animals, or reach distant water. It must prevent the heat produced inside it from becoming dangerous. Many early Homo erectus populations lived in warm African landscapes where sunlight, physical effort, and limited shade could raise that risk. Their relatively long legs and generally elongated limb proportions may have helped expose more skin surface from which heat could leave the body. A taller form also places much of the body farther above the hottest air immediately near the ground. Upright posture reduces the amount of surface directly facing the midday sun compared with a horizontal body, although it does not remove exposure and can offer less benefit when the sun is low. These principles make thermoregulation a plausible part of the Homo erectus body story, but fossils preserve bones rather than temperature, skin, or sweat. They cannot show precisely how much body hair these humans carried, how densely they sweated, or whether every population tolerated heat in the same way. Models of early human heat balance suggest that reduced body hair and effective sweating would have made activity in hot, open settings easier. Yet assigning fully modern cooling abilities to Homo erectus remains an inference, not a directly observed fact. Even the shape of the torso requires caution. The Nariokotomi skeleton was long reconstructed as having a narrow chest like that of many living humans from warm regions, but newer work indicates a deeper, broader rib cage. Homo erectus therefore combined long lower limbs with a torso that was not simply a modern tropical human body placed in the distant past. Variation across geography and time must also have been substantial. The lineage that began in Africa later occupied environments extending far beyond tropical heat, so one form could not have suited every population equally. Heat loss always carries costs. Sweating cools only when moisture can evaporate, and the water lost must eventually be replaced. A body capable of shedding heat efficiently may travel or work longer under certain conditions, but only if water remains reachable. Dry air can improve evaporation while accelerating dehydration. Humid air can slow evaporation even when sweat continues to leave the body. Shade, wind, clothing or coverings, activity level, and the hour of movement all change the result. No fossil site tells us whether Homo erectus normally rested at midday, moved at dawn, or selected shaded routes. Those behaviors are reasonable possibilities, not recovered schedules. The significance of anatomy lies in how it widened choices rather than abolished limits. Near the origin of Homo erectus, longer legs, larger bodies, and increasingly terrestrial lives joined an environment in which food and water were often separated. Better heat dissipation could have made searches across open ground less costly, while learned knowledge determined whether those searches ended at a dependable spring or an empty basin. Biological capacity and local memory had to work together. A heat-adapted body without water knowledge would fail quickly, while perfect knowledge would be difficult to use if movement itself caused dangerous overheating. Children, pregnant individuals, older adults, and anyone weakened by injury would face different limits. So group travel could not be organized around the strongest body alone. This may have encouraged patterns of pacing, resting, sharing information, and remaining near others, although archaeology cannot reconstruct them in detail. Across generations, populations that managed the relationship between heat, water, distance, and energy had more opportunities to survive periods when resources shifted. Their bodies did not conquer the sun. They offered a slightly broader margin within which behavior could respond. That margin may appear small beside later inventions, but repeated through countless ordinary journeys, it could help explain how Homo erectus persisted across landscapes where every useful movement, before shade or water was found, also carried the risk of losing water, energy, and the safe path home. A larger body gave Homo erectus new possibilities, but it also created a permanent demand that could never be postponed. Every additional kilogram of living tissue required energy for maintenance, movement, growth, healing, and reproduction, while a larger brain added another costly organ that needed a steady supply of fuel even during rest. Compared with many earlier hominins, Homo erectus generally carried a taller and heavier body. Though individuals and populations varied greatly across Africa and Eurasia, this change may have supported longer travel, wider searches for food, and greater tolerance of open landscapes. Yet none of those advantages could function unless enough calories were found often enough. A body capable of crossing more ground could also consume more energy while doing so, turning movement into a calculation between what might be gained and what must be spent. The same legs that widened the search area increased the consequences of choosing a poor route, because a group that walked far toward an empty water source had to return with less strength than it began. Larger bodies also grow slowly and require sustained nourishment during childhood, making survival dependent not only on what adults could find for themselves, but on whether younger individuals received enough food through vulnerable years. Fossils cannot show exactly how food was divided, and archaeology cannot recover every act of care. Yet the energetic burden of growth makes some degree of social dependence difficult to avoid. No child could build such a body alone, and no population could continue if repeated shortages prevented enough young people from reaching maturity. This connects the biology of Homo erectus directly to the structure of generations, because survival over deep time was achieved not by exceptional adults alone, but by groups that repeatedly supported growth, learning, and reproduction under changing conditions. Diet therefore became more than a list of foods. It became the foundation that allowed a larger body and brain to remain possible. Meat, marrow, edible plants, underground storage organs, seeds, fruits, insects, and other resources may have contributed in different proportions depending on place and season, while stone tools could help cut, pound, scrape, or open foods that teeth and hands handled less efficiently. Researchers still debate how often Homo erectus hunted, scavenged, cooked, or shared particular foods, so no single menu should be treated as universal. The safer conclusion is that increased energy needs would have favored reliable access to dense nutrition and the behavioral flexibility to use more than one source. This need may also explain why mobility, tool use, ecological knowledge, and social learning cannot be separated into independent answers. Movement brought the body toward resources, tools helped process some of them, memory reduced wasted effort, and companions could make dangerous opportunities more manageable. Failure in any one link could turn anatomical advantage into liability. A larger brain could support flexible responses, but it could not feed itself. A strong walking body could reach distant ground, but it could not know whether food remained there. Inherited proportions offered capacity, while learned information directed that capacity through a landscape that never stayed dependable. Near the beginning of this lineage, the human body crossed an energetic threshold in which broader movement and greater biological investment became joined. The price was continuous dependence on food, water, knowledge, and other people. This was not weakness added to progress, but the condition under which the new body could exist at all. The long endurance of Homo erectus may therefore have rested partly on an ability to keep paying this cost through many different environments without relying on one narrow resource. When familiar foods vanished, persistence depended on shifting attention toward alternatives that remained obtainable within the limits of skill and season. They did not survive because their bodies required little, but because enough populations repeatedly found ways to meet large needs before scarcity, injury, or distance ended the chain of generations. Before the familiar hand axe appeared, stone technology had already been part of human life for a very long time. The earliest known traditions of flake production began before the accepted appearance of Homo erectus, which means this lineage inherited a world in which some hominins already understood that striking one stone against another could create a sharp edge. These early tools are often described through cores, flakes, and hammerstones, but such words can make the process sound simpler than it was. A suitable stone had to be noticed, lifted, tested, held at an effective angle, and struck with enough control to detach a fragment without shattering the material or injuring the hand. The resulting flake might cut skin, meat, tendon, bark, or plant tissue, while the battered core could also remain useful for pounding or chopping. Not every object served one fixed purpose, and many stones were probably used briefly before being abandoned near the place where food was processed. This helps explain why early toolkits can look modest beside later technologies, while still representing an important extension of the body. Teeth could tear and hands could pull, but a fresh stone edge opened materials more quickly and with less effort, allowing access to flesh, marrow, hides, wood, and plants that might otherwise demand more time or strength. The tradition commonly called Oldowan was already widespread in Africa before Homo erectus emerged, so it should not be presented as an invention belonging exclusively to this lineage. Several kinds of hominins may have made or used early stone tools, and fossils are rarely found in a position that proves which individual struck a particular flake. Even where tools and bones occur in the same deposits, water, animals, erosion, and later movement of sediment can bring traces together. Careful excavation can narrow the possibilities, but it cannot turn every association into certainty. When early humans appeared at Dmanisi beyond Africa, They carried or recreated a broadly simple method of stone, working rather than relying on the later symmetrical hand axes, often associated with the Acheulean. This matters because it shows that geographical expansion did not require the most elaborate available technology. A small collection of cutting edges, combined with knowledge of water, animals, plants, and safe movement, could support life in unfamiliar ground. The decisive quality may not have been the appearance of the tool, but the ability to produce an adequate edge when local stone allowed it. Raw materials varied greatly, and a method suited to fine volcanic rock might need to change when only rounded river cobbles or brittle stone were available. Tool makers had to respond to the stone in front of them rather than repeat one perfect sequence everywhere. Near the origin of Homo erectus, this practical flexibility joined a body that was becoming more mobile and energetically demanding. Sharp flakes could reduce the time needed to process food, yet they did not create food, locate water, or protect a group from every predator. Technology remained one element inside a wider system of survival. It depended on recognizing useful material, remembering how fractures behaved, and passing enough skill to younger individuals for the practice to continue after experienced hands were gone. Archaeology cannot reveal whether teaching used gesture, demonstration, repeated imitation, or forms of vocal communication, and it cannot show that every person mastered the same techniques. It can show that similar basic actions appeared again across long intervals and distant regions. This repetition suggests that stoneworking became a durable habit beyond any single life. Its value came from reliable usefulness, not from beauty, symmetry, or permanent ownership. Before the hand axe added a more carefully shaped object to the record, the core and flake had already established a quieter principle that would remain central to human survival. The hand could be extended by knowledge stored not in bone alone, but in a learned relationship between impact, stone, and need. The appearance of the Acheulean tradition marked a visible change in the archaeological record, not because every earlier method disappeared, but because some toolmakers began shaping large pieces of stone through a longer sequence of planned removals. Hand axes, cleavers, and other large cutting tools required attention to the form hidden inside a cobble or block, since each strike altered the angles available for the next one. A maker often worked on more than one face, thinning edges, correcting uneven areas, and preserving enough mass for the object to remain strong. The finished tool could be pointed, oval, or broadly cutting, yet no single shape defined the entire tradition. Early examples were often thick and irregular, while later objects in some regions became thinner or more symmetrical. This difference should not be treated as a simple ladder from crude to perfect, because stone quality, intended task, individual skill, available time, and local custom all affected the result. The oldest widely accepted Acheulean evidence appears in Africa, not long after the earliest Homo erectus fossils, creating a close association between the lineage and the new technology. However, a tool cannot name its maker, and other human populations may also have produced Acheulean objects during the immense period in which the tradition continued. Even within the broad Homo erectus range, hand axes were not found everywhere. Dmanisi preserved simpler core and flake methods, while many Eastern Asian sites lacked the classic large bifaces common in parts of Africa, Western Eurasia, and South Asia. Older explanations imagined a fixed boundary between advanced hand axe makers and populations that had somehow failed to carry the idea eastward, but the evidence allows more careful possibilities. Suitable stone may have been scarce, smaller tools may have served local needs, wooden or bamboo implements may have left little trace, and different communities could preserve different learned practices. Absence from a site does not always mean absence from a mind. Where hand axes were made, their value probably extended beyond one task. Sharp margins could cut meat, separate joints, scrape material, work wood, or process plants, while a pointed end and heavier base created other possibilities. Traces of use sometimes help narrow these functions, but many specimens cannot be assigned one certain purpose. The tool was often useful because it remained adaptable, a durable form carried or reused when future needs were unknown. Near the origin of Homo erectus, this mattered within landscapes where food, water, and animal opportunities shifted. Producing a hand axe demanded more labor than striking a quick flake, so the investment made sense only when the tool, the raw material, or the learned routine offered continuing value. Its repeated manufacture over vast spans of time suggests that younger individuals watched skilled hands, practiced sequences, made errors, and gradually acquired control. Archaeology cannot tell us whether instructions were spoken, gestured, or simply demonstrated, and symmetry alone cannot prove a modern sense of beauty or symbolic meaning. What the stones do preserve is continuity without exact repetition. Generation after generation returned to a general solution while adjusting it to local rock and immediate need. This was not technological stillness, nor was it endless innovation. It was a stable framework, flexible enough to survive small changes without being reinvented from nothing. The Acheulean therefore became one form of memory outside the body, held in familiar movements between eye, hand, hammerstone, and stone, yet its uneven distribution warns that Homo erectus survived through more than one technological path. Hand axes widened what some populations could do, but the deeper strength may have been their ability to keep useful knowledge while changing the material expression of that knowledge when landscapes, resources, and inherited traditions differed. A tradition lasting so long was not a frozen recipe passed unchanged across continents, but a family of learned solutions, preserved when useful, modified when necessary, and sometimes set aside when another method answered problems with less effort or results. A stone tool can preserve a shape, but it cannot preserve the hands that taught that shape to another person. When archaeologists find similar methods repeated across distant generations, they see evidence that knowledge did not begin again with every child. Some skills could be discovered by chance, yet dependable toolmaking required more than one lucky strike. The learner had to recognize suitable stone, understand where force should be directed, control the hammer, judge an angle, and adjust after a failed removal. These actions are difficult to infer from the finished object alone, but experiments with modern learners show that stone knapping improves through observation, practice, correction, and different forms of instruction. Such experiments do not recreate the minds of Homo erectus, and they cannot prove exactly how ancient teaching occurred. They only demonstrate that useful techniques can be transmitted through several social pathways, including close watching, imitation, gesture, guided attention, and spoken explanation. For Homo erectus, speech resembling modern language remains unproven because stone tools do not preserve grammar, vocabulary, or vocal anatomy in a form that allows certainty. It is therefore safer to say that the repeated production of cores, flakes, and hand axes required social learning, while the exact communication supporting it remains unknown. A young learner may have watched an experienced individual choose a cobble, position it, and strike, then repeated the motion many times before producing a reliable edge. An older toolmaker may have slowed a movement, redirected a hand, offered a prepared core, or simply allowed patient observation. Each possibility is reasonable, but none can be described as a recovered scene. What the archaeological record does show is that broad technological traditions continued far beyond a single lifetime, which means behavior became connected across generations. This connection mattered because biological inheritance could provide hands, vision, coordination, and a brain capable of learning, but genes could not contain the location of a particular stone source or the exact response to one difficult material. Those details had to be acquired within a living group. Knowledge, therefore, existed in relationships, routines, and repeated actions, not inside one object alone. When an experienced person died, some knowledge could disappear, especially in a small or isolated population. When several people understood a skill, the chance of preserving it increased. Children also did more than copy, because practice introduced variation, and local conditions rewarded some changes while making others unnecessary. This may help explain why Acheulean tools share recognizable principles without becoming identical across Africa and Eurasia. Continuity did not require perfect copying, only enough accuracy to preserve a useful method and enough flexibility to adjust it. Near the origin of Homo erectus, such social memory would have joined a body able to travel farther and a diet requiring dependable returns from uncertain landscapes. A sharp edge could be made again after the previous tool was lost, but only if the method remained alive among people. This made culture a second form of inheritance, less stable than bone yet faster to change. It allowed a population to respond within a few generations rather than waiting for anatomy to evolve. Culture could also fail, because migration, death, scarcity, or separation might reduce the number of skilled individuals. The long survival of Homo erectus therefore cannot be credited to an uninterrupted accumulation of progress. Some communities may have preserved techniques for long periods, others may have simplified them, and still others may have lost practices entirely. Endurance came from repeatedly rebuilding useful knowledge within groups whose members learned from one another. Repeated learning also allowed methods to survive ordinary losses, because no single individual had to remember every movement, source, season, or practical solution alone among companions. Stone tools were durable traces of this process, but the deeper technology was the social bridge connecting an experienced hand to a younger one, carrying practical memory across lives that would otherwise have ended in silence. The diet of Homo erectus cannot be recovered as a complete menu, because food rarely survives in the ground in the same way that stone and bone do. Researchers must combine several kinds of evidence, and each kind answers a different question. Teeth reveal the shape of jaws, the thickness of enamel, patterns of wear, and sometimes microscopic scratches or pits left by chewing, but they do not identify every meal. A tooth built to tolerate certain forces may have handled foods that were important only during difficult seasons, while ordinary foods may leave weaker traces. Wear can also be altered by dust, grit, preparation methods, and the age of the individual. For this reason, dental anatomy describes capabilities and repeated pressures more securely than it describes one fixed diet. Animal bones provide another line of evidence when their surfaces carry cut marks made by sharp stone edges or percussion damage linked to breaking bones. These traces can show that hominins removed flesh, separated joints, or opened bones for marrow, yet they do not always reveal whether the animal was hunted, scavenged soon after death, or obtained in another way. Carnivores may have fed before or after humans, water may have moved remains, and trampling can imitate some marks. Investigators therefore study the shape, location, orientation, and sequence of damage rather than treating every scratched bone as proof of butchery. Stone tools found nearby can strengthen an interpretation, but association alone does not prove that one named human species used one particular carcass. Early African sites often contain more than one hominin lineage, and fossils are too scarce to connect each tool or bone securely with Homo erectus. Chemical evidence from tooth enamel adds a broader view. Stable carbon isotopes can indicate whether foods came mainly from ecological pathways associated with trees and shrubs, or from pathways associated with tropical grasses and sedges, including animals that ate those plants. This distinction can reveal shifts in the kinds of environments and food chains being used, but it cannot always separate grass, underground plant organs, grazing animal tissue, or other resources carrying similar chemical signals. Oxygen isotopes and trace elements may add information about water, habitat, or changes during tooth formation, although burial chemistry can sometimes alter fossil tissues and must be tested carefully. Evidence from Java, Africa, and other regions suggests that Homo erectus did not follow one identical diet across its entire range. Local plants, animals, rainfall, seasonality, and available technology differed too greatly for a universal menu to be likely. Near the origin of the lineage, a larger body and brain increased the need for dependable energy, making access to nutrient-rich foods important, but importance does not mean exclusivity. Meat and marrow may have supplied dense calories and valuable nutrients, while plant foods could provide carbohydrates, fiber, fats, and seasonal reliability. Many plant remains disappear without leaving clear archaeological signatures, so their silence in the ground must not be mistaken for absence from life. The surviving evidence is naturally biased toward hard teeth, stone edges, and large bones. A truthful reconstruction, therefore, begins by separating observation from inference. A cut-marked bone is direct evidence that a sharp tool contacted an animal carcass, while the identity of the toolmaker, the method of acquiring the carcass, and the social rules of sharing remain interpretations with different degrees of support. Isotope values directly measure chemistry preserved in enamel, while the exact foods producing that chemistry must be reasoned from local ecology. This careful method does not leave the diet unknowable. It reveals a pattern of varied resource use while preserving the limits of what ancient traces can say. And those limits matter because the survival of Homo erectus was probably supported not by one miraculous food, but by the repeated ability to obtain, process, and combine whatever reliable nourishment changing landscapes allowed across many environments and uncertain seasons over generations. Homo erectus probably did not survive by depending on one food in every place and season. The lineage occupied landscapes where rainfall, vegetation, animals, and water changed too greatly for a single permanent menu to remain reliable. Meat and marrow could provide concentrated energy, fat, and nutrients, especially valuable to bodies and brains that were becoming larger. But the archaeological evidence does not show that every population lived mainly by hunting large animals. Cut marks and broken bones demonstrate that early humans sometimes processed carcasses, yet those carcasses may have been hunted, scavenged soon after death, or taken from opportunities that cannot now be reconstructed. Predators, disease, accidents, drought, and natural deaths all placed animal bodies within ancient landscapes, and stone tools allowed hominins to remove flesh, open joints, and reach marrow when access was possible. Even successful hunting would not have followed one universal method, because prey size, terrain, group numbers, available weapons, and local knowledge differed across regions. Small animals, reptiles, birds, eggs, insects, and aquatic resources may also have contributed where they were obtainable, although many leave weak or ambiguous traces. Plant foods were likely equally important to the stability of daily life. Fruits, seeds, nuts, leaves, grasses, sedges, roots, tubers, and other underground storage organs could supply carbohydrates, fats, fiber, and minerals, but most decay without preserving a clear signature. This creates an archaeological imbalance in which large bones and stone edges remain visible, while soft plant tissues disappear. Absence of plant remains, therefore, cannot be treated as proof of a meat-dominated diet. Chemical evidence from teeth supports a broader picture. Studies of early Homo in East Africa indicate increasing use of resources connected with grass-based food webs, but such signals can come from grazing animals, grasses, sedges, or underground plant parts. So they do not identify one meal. Research on Homo erectus teeth from Java also suggests an omnivorous pattern and dietary changes within an individual life, consistent with using foods drawn from different ecological settings. These findings fit a lineage spread across environments that range from African lake basins to seasonal parts of Asia, where the same resources were never available in the same proportions. Seasonality would have made flexibility especially valuable. Fruit could be abundant for a short interval and absent later. Roots might remain available when surface plants dried. Animal herds could approach water during one season and move away during another. A carcass could provide a sudden surplus, but it could not be scheduled like a harvest. Survival depended on combining predictable foods with occasional high-value opportunities. Knowledge of when plants ripened, where tubers could be dug, which animals gathered near water, and how long a resource remained safe would have reduced wasted movement. That knowledge had to be renewed after migration, because a food recognized in Africa might have no exact equivalent in Georgia, China, or Java. Young individuals could learn what others collected and rejected, but changing conditions still required experimentation. Some choices would fail, and some unfamiliar foods could be dangerous. No balance was fixed, and each region imposed recurring limits on access to food. Food flexibility did not mean that Homo erectus could eat everything or live anywhere. It meant that enough populations were able to shift among several workable resources rather than collapse whenever one familiar source declined. This pattern connects directly to the human starting point of the lineage, where larger bodies, longer travel, and greater energy needs emerged within unstable habitats. The biological change increased dependence on dependable nourishment, while behavioral flexibility widened the number of ways that nourishment might be obtained. Meat did not replace plants, and plants did not remove the value of animal foods. Together, varied resources created overlapping supports, allowing one source to become more important when another weakened, and giving generations a broader margin against the seasonal uncertainty that repeatedly shaped the world of Homo erectus. The value of a varied diet was not that Homo erectus could eat anything, but that dependence on several resources reduced the danger created when one of them failed. In unstable landscapes, no food remained equally available through every season, and a population tied to a single plant, animal, or habitat would face severe risk when rainfall changed, herds moved, trees stopped fruiting, or water withdrew from familiar ground. Flexibility created overlapping supports rather than freedom from hunger. Roots and tubers could remain useful when fruits disappeared. Animal tissue could provide concentrated nutrition when access to plants declined. And small foods gathered repeatedly could sustain daily needs between rarer opportunities. Each resource carried limits. Because underground plants required knowledge and effort, meat could spoil or be difficult to obtain, nuts and seeds were seasonal, and aquatic foods depended on suitable water. A broad diet, therefore, demanded more information, not less. Individuals had to remember where foods occurred, when they became available, how they could be processed, and which ones carried danger. Stone tools extended this knowledge by opening bones, cutting tissues, scraping surfaces, and perhaps preparing plant materials, but the tools remained useful only when directed by local experience. Fire may later have widened the range of edible foods in some populations, yet the timing and regularity of controlled fire remain uncertain, so dietary flexibility cannot be reduced to cooking alone. Long before secure evidence of habitual fire, Homo erectus had already spread across distant environments, showing that other forms of processing and selection were sufficient for expansion. The origin of this lineage in changing African habitats helps explain why flexibility mattered from the beginning. Larger bodies and longer travel increased energy demands, while shifting lakes, grasslands, and wooded areas prevented any single source from offering permanent security. Populations that could combine several foods gained a wider margin when conditions changed, although that margin could still disappear during prolonged drought, disease, competition, or local ecological collapse. This pattern also helps explain why survival occurred differently across regions. African groups, populations in the Caucasus, communities in Eastern Asia, and later inhabitants of Java did not encounter identical plants or animals, so inherited preferences had to be adjusted through observation and learning. A useful method in one place could be abandoned in another, while unfamiliar resources could gradually become dependable through repeated experience. Children learn not only what to eat, but where to search, what signs to notice, and how much effort a food justified. Such knowledge was vulnerable because small groups could lose experienced individuals, migrations could separate people from known habitats, and sudden environmental change could make remembered routines obsolete. Dietary flexibility was therefore a living achievement, renewed across generations rather than a permanent trait stored safely inside the body. It also required balance, since consuming a wide range of foods does not guarantee that nutritional needs are met. Calories, protein, fat, minerals, water, and seasonal availability all had to align often enough for children to grow and adults to remain capable of movement and care. Homo erectus did not survive because every meal was abundant, but because enough populations repeatedly assembled workable diets from what local environments offered. When one resource weakened, another could sometimes carry greater weight, and when several failed together, even a flexible population could vanish. This flexibility also distributed risk within the group, since different individuals could notice, gather, or process different foods, making shared knowledge more dependable during prolonged scarcity. This is why a broad diet should not be treated as a simple answer to nearly 2 million years of endurance. It was one element connected to mobility, memory, tools, social learning, and geographical spread. Its deeper value lay in reducing the number of circumstances under which a single ecological loss became fatal, allowing the lineage to continue through changing seasons and landscapes without ever becoming independent of the living world that fed it. Fire leaves traces, but ancient landscapes can produce many of the same traces without a human hand controlling a flame. Charcoal may come from wildfire, burned bone may be carried into a cave by water or animals, and stone can change colour through heat that occurred before or after people used a site. This is why the earliest history of fire cannot be reconstructed by finding one darkened object and calling it a hearth. Researchers first ask whether the material was truly heated, then how hot it became, where it lay, whether nearby sediments were altered, and whether the burned remains form a pattern consistent with repeated human activity, microscopic structure, mineral changes, magnetic properties, chemical residues, and the distribution of fragments can help answer these questions. Yet each method has limits. Bone heated in a natural grass fire may resemble bone heated beside a camp, while ash can dissolve, blow away, or be disturbed until the original fire surface disappears. Caves create additional difficulty because they collect material over long periods. Predators drag bones inside, floods move sediment, roof falls, mix layers, and later visitors disturb traces left much earlier. An object discovered near stone tools may therefore belong to a different event unless its position and geological context are secure. Open-air sites have other problems, since wind, rain, erosion, roots, and repeated burning can scatter or destroy evidence. Near the beginning of Homo erectus, lightning and seasonal wildfire were ordinary features of many African environments, so contact with fire did not automatically mean the ability to create, preserve, or control it. A population might approach recently burned ground, collect cooked plants or animals, or carry a naturally burning branch without understanding how to ignite another flame. These possibilities are difficult to distinguish archaeologically, and none should be presented as a known scene. Sites such as Chesawanja and Kubifora in Kenya, Swartkrans and Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, preserve early signs of heating that have contributed important evidence, but the strength and meaning of those signs differ. At Wonderwerk, burned plant material and bone were found deep inside the cave within ancient sediments, making an external wildfire less likely and supporting human involvement. Even there, no preserved ring of stones or complete hearth reveals who tended the flame, how often it was used, or whether people could start it whenever needed. Association with Acheulean tools places fire within a human setting, but a tool tradition alone cannot identify one species with certainty. The long Homo erectus record spans regions and ages where evidence of burning is absent. Uncertain, or much clearer, warning against giving every population the same ability. Absence also needs caution, because fire traces are fragile, and a brief occupation may leave nothing recognizable. Still, fragile preservation cannot be used to claim fire wherever evidence is missing. The honest position lies between denial and assumption. Researchers also compare burned objects with nearby unburned ones, test whether heat came from above or below, and examine whether repeated clusters occupy the same surface. Stronger claims require several independent signals pointing toward the same event, because a persuasive interpretation depends less on one specimen than on converging evidence. Early hominins interacted with fire by at least some ancient intervals, while regular control and deliberate ignition became archaeologically convincing much later than the first appearance and dispersal of Homo erectus. This distinction matters for the central question of survival, because it prevents fire from becoming a magical answer placed at the origin of the lineage. Homo erectus had already endured changing climates, crossed great distances, processed food with stone, and occupied varied landscapes before secure evidence shows that every community relied on maintained flames. Fire may eventually have widened safety, warmth, light, and food processing, but the earliest burned traces remain a careful conversation between heat, sediment, context, and uncertainty, rather than a simple moment when darkness ended forever. When fire begins to appear in organized clusters rather than as scattered traces, the archaeological picture becomes clearer, because repeated burning in the same inhabited places is harder to explain through wildfire alone. At Gesher Beno Yaakov in the Jordan Valley, burned flint, seeds, wood, and other plant remains were concentrated in specific areas of an ancient lakeside occupation, dating to roughly 750,000 years ago. The pattern suggests that hominins repeatedly used fire within locations where they also made tools and processed food, although the fossils do not identify the fire users securely as Homo erectus. This distinction matters because several human populations may have occupied Western Asia during the long period covered by the broader lineage. What the site preserves is not the first flame ever handled, but a stronger sign that fire had become integrated into behavior. Later sites contain hearths, ash layers, and burned food remains that make repeated control increasingly difficult to deny. Even then, control does not necessarily mean reliable ignition. People could preserve embers, transport burning material, or obtain flame from natural fires without knowing how to create it at any moment. Keeping a fire alive would still require attention, fuel, protection from rain and wind, and decisions about where smoke could escape. This continuing labor shows why fire was a tool rather than a free gift. Its benefits existed only when a group could maintain the relationship between flame, fuel, space, and safety. Warmth may have extended activity into colder evenings and made some seasonal environments more tolerable, while light could illuminate cave interiors and increase awareness after darkness. Smoke and flame may have discouraged certain predators or insects, but neither formed an impenetrable barrier. A neglected fire could die, and an uncontrolled one could destroy shelter, food, or nearby vegetation. Heating food may have softened some plant tissues, reduced chewing effort, made certain nutrients easier to obtain, and killed some harmful organisms, yet cooking did not transform every food equally, and could also damage nutrients or create new risks. Burned bones and seeds sometimes support food preparation, though they do not always reveal whether heating was deliberate or incidental. Fire could also alter wood, improve visibility, and provide a place around which activities became organized, but archaeology cannot recover the emotions, conversations, or social meanings of those gatherings. It can only show that later occupations often arranged tools, bones, and working areas in relation to hearths. This spatial organization suggests repeated knowledge of how flame behaved inside a living place. The connection to human origins lies in the gradual movement of useful knowledge beyond anatomy. Homo erectus began with a body suited to broad terrestrial travel, and with stone methods inherited through social learning, while controlled fire added another learned process that could reshape immediate surroundings without changing the body itself. Populations that maintained fire gained options during cold, darkness, food processing, and encounters with animals, but the options varied with fuel and climate. Humid forests, open grasslands, caves, and dry plains did not offer the same wood or the same need for warmth. Fire use was therefore unlikely to spread as one uniform package. Some communities may have used it often, others occasionally, and some may have passed long intervals without secure access. As evidence becomes more consistent in later periods, it reveals a threshold crossed unevenly rather than one invention made once and inherited by everyone. Flame gradually joined walking, tools, diet, memory, and social dependence as another flexible support, increasing the number of conditions under which human groups could remain active without ever removing their dependence on water, fuel, weather, and one another. Repeated tending may also have created dependable points of return within familiar landscapes, allowing younger observers to learn through proximity and routine, while making the loss of skilled firekeepers serious for groups whose survival depended on knowledge carried by few people. Fire became important in human evolution, but it cannot carry the full explanation for the extraordinary duration of Homo erectus. The lineage had already existed for a vast interval and had reached regions beyond Africa before evidence for repeated, organized fire use becomes convincing at many sites. This order matters because it prevents a later advantage from being placed at the beginning, as though one discovery created every success that followed. The earliest Homo erectus populations survived through movement, stone technology, varied food use, social learning, and the ability of separated groups to persist under different conditions. Some may have encountered natural fires and used burned landscapes, while stronger evidence for maintained flames appears unevenly and becomes more common only during later periods. Even when fire was controlled, it did not remove the older requirements of life. Fuel had to be found, water still had to be reached, food still had to be gathered, and children still had to learn how to move safely through local ground. A flame could warm a cold night, but could not stop a long drought. It could discourage some animals, but could not protect a group from every predator, injury, disease, or conflict. It could soften food and widen certain dietary choices, Yet it could not make an empty landscape productive. Dependence on fire could also create new vulnerability when rain, wind, scarce wood, migration, or the loss of experienced people made flames difficult to maintain. This does not reduce the importance of fire. It places fire within the larger network that made survival possible. Controlled burning may have extended activity into darkness, improved comfort in cold seasons, altered food processing, and created dependable places where tasks and learning gathered. These benefits could strengthen populations already capable of sharing knowledge and organizing behavior around repeated needs. However, the archaeological pattern does not show one moment when every Homo erectus community received the same ability. Distant populations lived with different climates and fuels, and some regions preserved no secure evidence that fire structured daily life. Absence can reflect poor preservation, but it can also warn against assuming a universal practice. The human lineage that began in unstable African environments had therefore learned to persist before fire became a dependable support everywhere. Its deeper strength may have rested in combining advantages without requiring any one of them to remain available at all times. When fire was absent, movement, tools, diet, memory, and cooperation still mattered. When fire was present, it joined those older supports and changed how some problems could be approached. This layered form of adaptation helps explain why no single invention should be credited with nearly 2 million years of endurance. Technologies can widen the range of possible responses, but populations survive only when those responses continue to match local conditions across generations. Fire itself had to become learned knowledge, carried not by anatomy but by attention to fuel, embers, smoke, wind, and danger. If that knowledge disappeared, the body did not automatically recover it. The survival value lay in repeated practice and transmission. Just as it did with stone, Homo erectus was not preserved by a permanent shield of flame, and its descendants were never independent of climate. Fire offered another margin, sometimes narrow and sometimes transformative, within a life still governed by energy, season, distance, and loss. The colder truth is that long survival did not come from escaping nature, but from repeatedly assembling enough imperfect supports to endure within it. Fire was one of those supports, powerful when available, limited when conditions turned against it, and meaningful only because generations already possessed bodies, habits, and relationships capable of keeping its benefits alive. Its importance grew not because it replaced earlier adaptations, but because it could connect them, making tools more useful, foods easier to process, nights more manageable, and shared routines more stable wherever fuel, knowledge, and careful attention remained available. The Pleistocene was not one long ice age holding the world in a single frozen condition. It was an epoch of repeated cooling and warming, with changes in rainfall, vegetation, sea level, and animal distribution unfolding across many different rhythms. Some shifts developed over tens of thousands of years as Earth's orbit altered the amount and seasonal pattern of sunlight reaching different regions. Others occurred more quickly within longer trends, changing lakes, rivers, and grasslands over intervals that populations could experience through several generations. Homo erectus lived through much of this unstable epoch, but no individual witnessed the full movement from one climatic state to another. People experienced local consequences, such as a wet basin becoming less dependable, a colder season lasting longer, familiar animals moving elsewhere, or woodland giving way to more open ground. The scientific record of these conditions comes from lake sediments, ocean cores, ancient soils, fossil pollen, animal remains, cave deposits, and chemical signals preserved in minerals. Each source records only portions of the environment and often represents a different geographical scale. An ocean core may preserve broad changes in global ice volume, while sediment from an African lake records rainfall and erosion within one basin. These records cannot be laid over every fossil site, as though climate changed identically everywhere. A wetter interval in one region could coincide with drying elsewhere, and a global cooling phase could produce very different local habitats depending on altitude, monsoon patterns, coastlines, and mountain barriers. This regional complexity matters because Homo erectus was spread across Africa and large areas of Asia. One population might face shrinking water and expanding dry grassland, while another lived beside a productive river or within a more wooded landscape. The lineage did not survive one universal climate test. Separated populations encountered different combinations of heat, cold, moisture, seasonality, and ecological disruption. Near the African origin of Homo erectus, shifting mosaics of open and wooded habitats had already placed value on mobility and varied food use. As populations expanded, those inherited capacities entered settings where the timing and scale of change were unfamiliar. Northern groups faced stronger winters and sharper seasonal contrasts, while tropical populations could experience changing rainfall, forests, rivers, and coastlines. Lower sea levels sometimes exposed broad land connections, and wetter phases could open vegetated corridors through areas that were otherwise difficult to cross. Later drying or rising seas could close those same routes, separating communities that had once been connected. Climate therefore shaped both movement and isolation, widening opportunities during some intervals and narrowing them during others. It would be misleading to say that hardship automatically made Homo erectus stronger. Severe change could reduce food, increase mortality, fragment populations, and cause local extinction. Environmental variability created selection and opportunity only among the groups that survived its immediate costs. Stable periods were also important because they allowed populations to grow, learn a landscape, and maintain knowledge across generations. Endurance required both the ability to adjust during disruption and the capacity to use calmer intervals without becoming dependent on conditions that would eventually end. The starting point of this human lineage was thus carried forward through a world where no habitat remained guaranteed. Long legs, tools, dietary breadth, and social learning offered possible responses, but their usefulness shifted with the ground beneath them. Climate did not command a single evolutionary path, and Homo erectus did not predict the next cycle. Survival emerged when enough local groups responded adequately to the particular changes they encountered, while distant groups preserved the lineage when others disappeared. Distance made cooperation impossible across continents, yet it also prevented one regional disaster from becoming the immediate ending of every surviving community. Across deep time, this uneven distribution of risk may have mattered as much as any special adaptation, because no drought, cold phase, flood, or habitat transformation reached every population in exactly the same way at exactly the same moment. Homo erectus is often pictured walking across an open savanna, but the evidence places these populations in a more varied world. Grassland was important in many regions, yet it was frequently joined to rivers, lake margins, wooded patches, shrubland, wetlands, and seasonally dry ground. The useful habitat was often not one broad biome, but an edge where several resources came close together. Water attracted animals, supported edible plants, exposed stone in riverbeds, and created routes through otherwise difficult country. At Illoret in northern Kenya, footprints attributed to Homo erectus occur near an ancient lakeshore bordered by open grassland, showing repeated movement through a water-rich setting rather than through an empty plain. Such places could concentrate food and travel opportunities, but they also concentrated danger, including large carnivores, deep mud, flooding, insects, and competition around limited water. Occupation, therefore, does not mean comfort. It means that the benefits were sufficient for people to return despite the risks. Evidence from Olduvai Gorge presents an even broader sequence, with early humans using river-influenced surfaces, floodplains, lakeside woodland, fern meadows, dry steppe, and landscapes altered by natural fire at different times. Not every occupation can be assigned securely to Homo erectus, because several hominin forms lived during parts of this interval, yet the pattern shows that early Homo was not confined to one vegetation type. Later evidence from the same region suggests that Homo erectus could repeatedly use highly arid surroundings when streams, abandoned channels, or small water bodies created local refuges. This does not mean they became desert specialists able to wander without water. Their activity remained focused around ecological points, where the larger dry landscape briefly offered drink, food, shade, animals, and workable material. The distinction is important because adaptability is often mistaken for independence. Homo erectus could use several kinds of environment only when each contained enough connected resources to support biological needs. Dense tropical forest may have presented different difficulties, including limited visibility, unfamiliar foods, poorer preservation of open ground travel routes, and stone that was not always easy to obtain. The present record does not show Homo erectus occupying every forest, high mountain, desert interior, or cold northern extreme. Wide distribution was real, but it had boundaries, near the African beginning of the lineage. Bodies suited to terrestrial movement and diets capable of drawing from several food chains developed within habitat mosaics rather than one stable grassland. This origin may have prepared later populations to recognize useful edges, but it did not provide knowledge of distant ecosystems in advance. Every migration required local learning. Plants that were safe in one basin could be absent in another. Animals could follow different seasons, and a river that provided water could become dangerous during floods. Success depended on noticing small contrasts within the landscape, such as where grass remained green, where birds indicated shallow water, where trees offered shade, or where exposed sediment held stone suitable for cutting. These details could guide movement more effectively than any general preference for savanna. They also changed quickly enough that inherited routines sometimes failed. A drying lake might leave salt, dust, and scattered pools, while a river could abandon one channel and begin feeding another. Groups that continued returning to an old location could find the resources gone. Flexibility therefore included leaving, shortening a stay, changing the foods gathered, or concentrating activity around a smaller refuge. This demanded patience, memory, and repeated adjustment across many uncertain local seasons. Archaeology records some of these returns through repeated tools, footprints, and occupation surfaces, while silence between them may represent absence, erosion, or evidence not yet found. It cannot show continuous residence where only separate visits are preserved. The long survival of Homo erectus was not achieved by making every landscape into a home, but by finding temporary homes within many changing landscapes, and by recognizing when those homes had ceased to support the next generation. Homo erectus did not survive by making nature stable. Survival came from changing routes, foods, tools, and habits when the ground no longer supported familiar routines. A shrinking lake could force people toward another water source. A colder season could shorten gathering time, and a wooded corridor could replace open grassland where movement had once been easier. None of these responses required control over climate, only enough attention to recognize that yesterday's solution was failing. Populations could leave a camp sooner, return at a different season, follow animals toward water, select another stone source, or use foods that had previously been less important. Archaeology rarely preserves such decisions directly, yet repeated occupations in changing environments show that human groups returned to some landscapes under different ecological conditions and sometimes abandoned them when local opportunities narrowed. Flexibility therefore appeared through altered behavior within inherited limits, not through freedom from those limits. Bodies still required water, calories, rest, and safe conditions for children, while tools still depended on available material and learned skill. When several necessities disappeared together, adaptation could fail, and a local population could vanish. The long endurance of Homo erectus was built from many such local endings as well as many continuations. Geographical spread mattered because distant groups did not face the same drought, flood, cold interval, or habitat loss at the same moment. One region could become difficult while another remained productive, allowing the wider lineage to persist even when particular communities disappeared. This was not cooperation across continents. Since separated populations may have had no contact and no knowledge of one another, it was a demographic consequence of occupying a broad and uneven world. Risk became distributed across places. An environmental change selected among populations rather than striking them as one united society. Near the African beginning of the lineage, changing mosaics of lake margins, grasslands, woodland, and dry ground had already linked human life to movement and local learning. As descendants spread through Eurasia, those basic capacities entered climates with unfamiliar seasons, animals, vegetation, and raw materials. Inherited anatomy could make travel possible, but only experience could reveal where a river remained dependable or when a route had become dangerous. Learned knowledge offered speed that biological evolution could not, because a group could change a practice within a lifetime. While bodies changed only across many generations, even useful knowledge was temporary, since a remembered spring could dry, a herd route could shift, and a stone exposure could become buried. Survival required memory and the willingness, or necessity, to depart from memory when evidence on the ground changed. This balance prevented tradition from becoming a trap while preserving enough continuity for children to learn before confronting uncertainty themselves. No population needed to invent an entirely new way of life every season, but none could rely forever on exact repetition. The archaeological record of Homo erectus, with persistent stone traditions alongside regional variation, fits this combination of stability and adjustment. Core principles endured, while materials, tool forms, settlement choices, and food emphasis could differ. Climate models and site evidence suggest that suitable habitats expanded and contracted repeatedly, opening corridors during some intervals and isolating populations during others. Those changes created opportunities for dispersal, but also periods of contraction when survival margins narrowed. Flexibility did not turn every crisis into success, and the nearly 2 million year span should never be read as an uninterrupted triumph. It represents enough successful replacement of generations across enough regions to keep the lineage present, while countless individual lives and communities ended. Homo erectus endured not by defeating changing nature, but by remaining responsive within it, repeatedly assembling workable lives from temporary water, seasonal food, inherited bodies, shared skills, and landscapes that offered no promise of remaining the same. When one combination failed, another population elsewhere could still preserve enough of the older pattern to begin adjusting again under very different local conditions. No individual Homo erectus survived for 2 million years. The continuity belonged to generations that repeatedly replaced one another while bodies aged, children grew, and local groups faced losses that left no record. This distinction changes the meaning of endurance, because a lineage can last only when enough young individuals survive long enough to learn, reproduce, and support another generation after the adults who guided them are gone. Fossils preserve death more readily than they preserve childhood, yet teeth contain growth lines that allow researchers to estimate how development unfolded. Evidence from Nariokotomi, Java, and Dmanisi suggests that early Homo did not share the fully prolonged childhood of modern humans, although recent work indicates that some extension of growth and learning had already begun. The exact pace probably varied, and no fossil can reveal the daily experience of one child. What can be said more safely is that a larger body, a developing brain, and learned tool use required sustained nourishment and repeated contact with experienced companions. A child could inherit legs suited to walking and hands capable of striking stone, but could not inherit the route to water, the season of a fruit, the danger of a predator, or the angle needed to detach a useful flake. Those details existed outside the genes and had to pass through observation, practice, correction, and ordinary participation in group life. Every death, therefore, carried more than biological loss. When an experienced individual disappeared, knowledge of a spring, stone source, animal path, or difficult technique could disappear as well, especially where populations were small. Survival depended on enough overlap between ages for knowledge to move before its carriers were lost. This does not prove that Homo erectus organized childhood, teaching, or family life exactly as modern humans do. Archaeology cannot identify parents, grandparents, rules, affection, or deliberate lessons in most ancient settings. The conclusion is narrower, because immature bodies could not meet all energetic and practical needs alone, and complex skills could not remain stable without some form of social learning. Adults also depended on the continuation of the young, since a group composed only of capable workers would end when they died. Endurance required calories to be directed toward growth, time to be tolerated while learners made mistakes, and protection sufficient for vulnerable individuals to remain within the population. These investments may have been shorter and less intensive than those of Homo sapiens, but they still linked immediate survival to a future that no individual could personally enter. The human starting point of Homo erectus was therefore not merely a new anatomy spreading across continents. It was a reproductive chain in which bodies, skills, and local memory had to arrive together in each new generation. Drought could break that chain by weakening mothers and children. Injury could remove skilled adults. Isolation could reduce partners, and a poor season could leave too few survivors to recover. Many local populations probably ended in such quiet ways, while others continued and divided, carrying part of the lineage into different landscapes. The nearly 2 million year span was produced by this uneven pattern, not by uninterrupted population growth. Births succeeded deaths often enough somewhere, learning succeeded often enough somewhere, and children became capable adults often enough somewhere for the broader lineage to remain present. Seen at this scale, survival was not an achievement stored in a powerful individual or a perfect tool. It was the repeated restoration of a functioning group after every death, every childhood, and every environmental change. The essential unit was neither the lone survivor nor the isolated invention, but the network of dependent lives around them. Infants required care. Learners required examples. Injured adults may have required tolerance, and every generation needed enough social continuity to turn inherited capacity into usable behavior. Homo erectus endured because the practical beginning of humanity could be rebuilt inside new bodies, one generation at a time. A small group could offer Homo erectus forms of protection and support that no isolated individual could reproduce, but the fossil record does not preserve the rules, emotions, or daily agreements that held such groups together. What remains are indirect signs, including repeated occupations, shared access to tools and carcasses, injured individuals who survived for some time, and the practical demands created by children, movement, and dangerous landscapes. These traces suggest social dependence without revealing a modern family structure or a complete system of cooperation. Several people traveling together could watch different directions, notice predators earlier, and reduce the chance that one person faced danger alone. They could also search different areas of a landscape, increasing the possibility that someone found water, edible plants, stone, or animal remains before the group exhausted its energy. Such advantages were not automatic, because more people also required more food and could create competition when resources were scarce. A group became useful only when its members tolerated one another sufficiently to remain coordinated through movement, feeding, rest, and care. Archaeology cannot tell us whether food was divided equally, whether authority existed, or whether every injured person received help. It can show that some early humans survived conditions that may have limited independent movement or chewing, which makes assistance a reasonable possibility, though not the only explanation. The famous toothless individual from Dmanisi lived long enough for the jaw to heal after losing most teeth, suggesting continued access to food that could be eaten despite severe dental loss, softer resources, natural healing, personal adaptation, or support from companions may all have contributed, so the fossil should not be turned into a certain story of compassion. Its importance lies in showing that vulnerability did not always end a life immediately. For a long-lived lineage, even modest support could matter when repeated across generations. An injured adult who survived might continue carrying knowledge of roots, stone, seasons, or danger, while a child protected during illness could later become a capable learner and parent. Social tolerance could therefore preserve both bodies and information. Near the origin of Homo erectus, larger energy needs and wider travel made solitary survival increasingly difficult, because water, food, tools, and young dependents had to be managed across changing distances. Moving as a group slowed the strongest individuals, yet it also allowed the population to include those who could not travel alone. Adults could remain near children while others searched nearby, or several individuals could respond when a predator approached, although these specific arrangements remain possibilities rather than observed facts. Repeated presence at certain places may indicate that locations were remembered and reused by more than one generation, creating shared familiarity with safe ground and dependable resources. This kind of knowledge became more reliable when distributed among several people, instead of resting in one memory. If one individual died, another might still know the route or technique. End quote. If only one person held the knowledge, the group became more fragile. Small groups therefore balanced efficiency against vulnerability because they were large enough to share risks but still exposed to accidents, disease, conflict, and loss of reproductive mates. Isolation could cause skills and genetic diversity to decline, while occasional contact between groups may have renewed both, though direct evidence for the frequency and nature of such contact is limited. Homo erectus did not survive, because every community was harmonious. Some groups likely divided, failed, or disappeared. The broader lineage endured because enough communities maintained the minimum social continuity needed to raise young, preserve practical knowledge, and recover after ordinary losses. Their strength may have rested less in permanent unity than in repeated acts of coordination whose details vanished, leaving only the biological and archaeological consequences of lives that were rarely lived entirely alone. Across countless journeys, survival depended on companions remaining close enough to share warning, knowledge, labour, and the burden of vulnerable lives together. Across Africa and Eurasia, Homo erectus did not exist as one population sharing the same camp, the same tools, or the same memories. The distances between East Africa, the Caucasus, northern China, and Java were too great for continuous contact, and the landscapes between them repeatedly opened and closed as climate, rivers, deserts, forests, and sea levels changed. What scientists call one lineage was therefore made of many local populations whose connections may have ranged from occasional contact to complete isolation. Some groups expanded when water, food, and suitable ground became available, while others contracted into smaller refuges or disappeared when conditions worsened. The fossil record preserves only a few points within this shifting pattern, so a skull from one region cannot be assumed to represent every population alive at the same time. Differences in body size, skull shape, and tool traditions may reflect geography, time, inherited variation, local adaptation, or the way scientists divide fossils into categories. They do not reveal a single united people moving together across the ancient world. This separation carried both danger and protection. A small isolated group could lose skilled individuals, reproductive partners, or useful knowledge, making recovery after disease, injury, or poor seasons difficult. Repeated isolation could also allow anatomical and behavioral differences to accumulate, while renewed contact might exchange mates, techniques, or information, though direct evidence for such meetings is limited. At the same time, distance prevented one local disaster from reaching every population. A drought in one African basin, a severe winter in Western Asia, or environmental change on Java could end a community without ending Homo erectus everywhere. The long duration of the lineage was partly a consequence of this uneven geography, because survival did not have to succeed in all places at once. It had to continue somewhere often enough for populations to expand again, when new opportunities appeared. This pattern was not steady progress outward. Occupation could advance, pause, retreat, and return, and some regions may have been entered more than once by different groups. Land connections in Southeast Asia changed with sea level, while climatic shifts across Eurasia altered the routes and habitats available to early humans. A population reaching new ground might remain for many generations, become separated from relatives, and later vanish without leaving descendants known to science. Another population elsewhere could continue, carrying a related body plan and learned practices into a different future. Near the origin of Homo erectus, this structure may already have been forming as communities moved between changing African habitats. Once the lineage spread farther, every movement increased both the number of possible refuges and the chance of fragmentation. Wide distribution was therefore not the same as strength in every location. Many local populations were probably small, vulnerable, and temporary, while the broader pattern endured because their risks were not perfectly synchronized. This helps explain why nearly 2 million years of survival should not be imagined as one continuous demographic success. The lineage could shrink dramatically, lose regions, and preserve only scattered populations before expanding again. Archaeology cannot measure the exact number of people involved, and genetics is rarely available for fossils this old, so population structure must be inferred cautiously from anatomy, chronology, geography, and material culture. Even so, the evidence supports a world of separated communities rather than a single connected society. Homo erectus survived through a moving network of local beginnings and local endings, in which no group carried the whole future. Yet, enough groups remained beyond the reach of each other's disasters to keep the lineage from disappearing at once. Their endurance emerged from this repeated redistribution of life, as births restored numbers in one refuge while deaths emptied another, and as movement occasionally reconnected landscapes that had been divided. No central population directed the process, and no generation understood its scale, yet the arrangement of small communities allowed human continuity to outlast countless local failures. A lineage lasting across nearly 2 million years could not remain physically unchanged, because every generation introduced variation, and every separated population lived under different pressures. The earliest fossils commonly placed within Homo erectus already show a broad range of body and skull forms, while later specimens from Africa and Asia had further differences in size, shape, and proportion. The long, low brain case, strong brow region, and thick cranial bones remain useful features, but they do not appear in exactly the same form in every individual. Some early skulls were small, others were much larger, and fossils separated by geography or hundreds of thousands of years can differ enough to create debate about whether they belong to one variable lineage or several related species. This uncertainty is expected when a name covers populations spread across continents and immense time. Evolution does not preserve a type specimen unchanged while descendants move through new climates. It works through inherited variation, local survival, separation, contact, and loss. A population in East Africa faced different seasons, foods, and disease pressures from one living in northern China or Java, and even nearby groups could become isolated when lakes dried, rivers shifted, or open corridors closed. Over many generations, such separation could alter average body size, skull form, teeth, and other features, without producing one sudden moment when an old form became a new one. The fossil record captures scattered points within that gradual and uneven process. Dmanisi preserves early humans with relatively small brains and considerable variation among individuals found at one site, warning that difference alone does not always indicate separate species. African fossils include both smaller and larger crania, while specimens from later periods sometimes show combinations of traits linking earlier Homo erectus with later human forms. The Dhaka skull from Ethiopia, for example, has been interpreted as anatomically intermediate within an African sequence, though broader evolutionary relationships remain debated. Java and China preserve their own regional patterns, shaped by long isolation, local ancestry, and incomplete sampling. None of these populations should be imagined as a frozen copy carried from the birthplace of the lineage. What continued was a broad evolutionary framework capable of producing variation while remaining recognizable to researchers. Brain size generally became larger across parts of the record, yet the change was neither smooth nor universal, and a larger skull cannot be treated as a direct measure of intelligence or survival. Body size also varied, with smaller individuals existing beside evidence for much larger ones. Sex, age, nutrition, climate, and population history may all contribute to these differences, but fossils rarely allow every cause to be separated. Near the origin of Homo erectus, the important transformation was not one perfect body, but a flexible range of bodies increasingly committed to terrestrial movement and supported by learned behavior. That range could respond to local conditions through both biological and cultural change. Tools could be altered within a generation, diets could shift within a season, and anatomy could change more slowly as populations remained separated. Long survival therefore included transformation at several speeds. A tool tradition might persist while skull form changed, or anatomy might remain broadly similar while local practices differed. This layered continuity helps explain why the lineage can appear stable from a distance and varied when examined closely. The early and late members of Homo erectus were related through descent, but they were not identical travelers moving through an unchanged world. Their endurance was partly the endurance of variation itself, because a lineage able to contain multiple body sizes, regional forms, and workable behaviors possessed more than one way to meet changing conditions. What survived for so long was not a fixed design, but a broad human pattern repeatedly reshaped by geography, time, and the unequal fate of separated populations. Variation also made failure less synchronized, because no environmental pressure acted on every body and population identically at once. Africa, China, and Java preserve three of the most important regional records assigned to Homo erectus, but they do not offer three identical versions of one unchanging human form. The African record begins near the origin of the lineage and includes fossils with considerable variation in brain size, skull shape, and body size. Some researchers call many of these African fossils Homo ergaster, reserving Homo erectus for Asian populations, while others use Homo erectus in a broader sense that includes both. This disagreement reflects different judgments about how much variation one long-lived species can contain, not a dispute over whether the fossils exist. In China, remains from sites such as Zhoukoudian, Lantian, Nanjing, Hexian, and other localities show a long human presence across regions with different climates. Many Chinese fossils share a long low skull, strong brow ridges, and other features commonly associated with Asian Homo erectus, yet they are not perfectly uniform. Some specimens resemble one another closely, while others show combinations that have led researchers to question whether every Middle Pleistocene fossil in China belongs within the same category. The fossil record is incomplete, and new discoveries can change which similarities appear central. Java preserves another long sequence, beginning with early remains from Sangiran and including later fossils from places such as Trinil and Gandong. These populations lived in tropical Southeast Asia, across major changes in rivers, vegetation, volcanic landscapes, and sea level. Javanese skulls often display thick cranial bones and strongly developed structures, but early and late specimens differ, and not every feature follows a simple progression. Some later Javanese fossils have historically received separate names. While many researchers still interpret them as late regional forms of Homo erectus, comparisons among these regions show why spread economy becomes difficult across nearly 2 million years. An African fossil and a Javanese fossil may share a broad body plan and several skull traits while differing more than two individuals from one local population. Distance allowed variation to accumulate, and time added further change. Populations could be separated for thousands of generations, experience different diets and climates, and still remain connected through deeper ancestry. Scientific names try to organize this pattern, but the pattern itself was created by living populations that did not recognize those boundaries. Near the beginning of Homo erectus, movement out of Africa spread a flexible human form into several ecological worlds. After that expansion, the lineage no longer followed one biological path. Regional populations became distinct in ways shaped by isolation, local survival, population size, and occasional movement between areas when geography allowed. Archaeology cannot determine how often distant groups exchanged genes, and ancient DNA has generally not survived from fossils of this age. Surviving protein evidence from ancient enamel remains limited and cannot yet provide a complete family tree for all populations. Anatomy therefore remains central, but anatomy is influenced by growth, sex, age, and preservation as well as ancestry. A crushed skull can appear broader, missing bone can hide important features, and a small sample can make rare traits seem typical. Cautious comparison is therefore more reliable than forcing every fossil into a rigid sequence. The enduring lesson is not that Africa, China, and Java contained three separate civilizations or three perfectly separate species. It is that Homo erectus became a geographically broad and biologically varied lineage, whose regional forms could remain recognizable while changing in different directions. This diversity may have strengthened survival by preventing every population from sharing exactly the same weaknesses, yet it also created isolation and local extinction. The name Homo erectus is useful because it connects these fossils within a broad evolutionary history, but its edges remain open to revision as new evidence reveals how many different human populations once carried that history across the ancient world. Their differences remind us that longevity can preserve variation rather than erase it, allowing one lineage to contain regional histories at once. The long survival of Homo erectus was not the survival of a single perfect form. It was the survival of a lineage, able to change without losing every feature that made it recognizable. Bodies varied, skulls changed, populations separated, and learned practices shifted as people entered environments that differed from the African settings near the beginning of their history. This means endurance cannot be understood as resistance to change. It may have depended on change occurring at several levels and at several speeds. Anatomy altered slowly across generations, while routes, foods, tool-making choices, and places of rest could change within a lifetime. When conditions remained familiar, inherited routines reduced risk because people did not need to solve every problem again. When water moved, vegetation changed, or useful stone became scarce, exact repetition could become dangerous. Populations that preserved broad skills while adjusting their expression had more possible responses than populations tied to one narrow solution. A hand axe tradition could continue, while local stone changed its size and shape. A familiar method of searching near rivers could remain useful even when the plants and animals beside those rivers differed. A body suited to terrestrial travel could support movement through many landscapes without being equally suited to every climate. Continuity, therefore, existed in principles rather than in identical behavior. This helps explain why the archaeological record can show very long-lasting technologies beside regional variation and occasional disappearance. Stability was useful because reliable knowledge saved time and energy, but flexibility was useful because no landscape remained reliable forever. The balance between them was never guaranteed. Too little change could leave a group trapped in habits that no longer worked, while too much loss of tradition could erase skills that children needed before they could survive independently. The lineage persisted when enough communities maintained practical memory while allowing that memory to bend under local pressure. Biological variation may have provided another form of protection. Differences in body size, skull form, growth, and physiology meant that environmental change would not affect every population in exactly the same way. One regional form might decline while another remained viable, though fossils cannot show every trait responsible for those outcomes. Wide distribution multiplied such differences and separated their risks. It also produced isolation, small populations, and local extinctions, so variation was not an automatic advantage. Its value appeared only when some forms remained workable under conditions that defeated others. Near the human starting point represented by Homo erectus, survival was already becoming a layered process in which genes, development, culture, geography, and social learning interacted. None of these layers stayed fixed, and none acted alone. A change in climate altered food, which altered movement, which changed contact between groups, which could affect both learned traditions and biological inheritance. The result was not a straight path toward a more advanced human. It was a branching history of populations responding unevenly, sometimes expanding and sometimes ending. Some descendants may have contributed to later human lineages, while others disappeared without leaving a clearly identified continuation. Taxonomy cannot capture every transition because names divide a process that was gradual and geographically scattered. The phrase Homo erectus gathers that process into one useful category, but the living reality was always more varied than the label. Their extraordinary duration, therefore, does not show that evolution found a final design almost 2 million years ago. It shows that a broad human pattern could be repeatedly modified while remaining viable across many worlds. Each successful adjustment was temporary, because the conditions supporting it could disappear. Yet temporary solutions repeated across enough generations could create remarkable longevity. This is the quiet scale on which evolution works, preserving no intention, promise, or final destination. Only populations that remain capable of continuing. What endured was not sameness, but enough continuity to preserve useful foundations, and enough variation to prevent every population from sharing one identical path toward failure. The last known fossils of Homo erectus do not come from the place where the lineage began, but from Java, far from its earlier African origin. At Ngandong, beside the Solo River, researchers recovered a group of skull caps and leg bones from deposits formed late in the Pleistocene. Careful dating of the surrounding landscape and sediments places these remains between about 117,000 and 108,000 years ago. This range currently makes Ngandong the youngest securely dated occurrence widely assigned to Homo erectus, but it does not provide the exact day, century, or even millennium when the lineage became extinct. Fossils record where bodies happen to be preserved and discovered, not every place where living populations remained. A small group could have survived elsewhere without leaving recognizable remains. While the last individuals at Ngandong may have died earlier or later than the deposits suggest within the limits of dating, the site therefore marks the latest known presence, not a proven final moment for the entire species. This distinction protects the evidence from becoming a dramatic ending it cannot support. The Ngandong population lived in a changing river landscape, whose surrounding environment had become different from the more open conditions that had supported earlier Javanese Homo erectus. Studies of animals, sediments, and vegetation suggest a transition toward warmer and wetter settings with expanding rainforests nearby, while the broad grassland habitats associated with many large grazing animals became reduced. Homo erectus had persisted on Java through repeated changes in river systems, volcanic activity, sea level, and climate. Yet every adaptive range has boundaries. Bodies and practices that functioned across open woodland and grassland mosaics may have faced narrowing opportunities as forests spread and familiar animals declined. This does not prove that rainforest alone caused extinction, because population size, isolation, food availability, disease, competition, and ordinary demographic chance may also have mattered. Java itself changed connection with mainland Southeast Asia as sea levels rose and fell, sometimes opening broad land routes and sometimes surrounding populations with water. When connections closed, isolated groups could no longer receive new mates, knowledge, or numbers from distant communities. A population already reduced by environmental change could then become increasingly vulnerable to several poor generations in succession. Near the beginning of Homo erectus, geographical expansion had protected the lineage by separating risks across continents, but near its ending, that same separation may have left late populations without support from elsewhere. The fossil record outside Java had already become difficult to classify, because later human forms in Africa and Eurasia were changing along other evolutionary paths. Homo erectus did not vanish from every region at one synchronized moment. Populations disappeared, transformed, or contributed to later lineages at different times. While the distinct Javanese form remained unusually late, Ngandong reveals the final known continuation of that regional history, not a lonely band consciously guarding an ancient way of life. No evidence tells us that these people knew they were among the last, and assigning such awareness would turn scientific silence into invented thought. They would have faced immediate needs familiar across the lineage, including water, food, movement, injury, childhood, and seasonal change. Their extraordinary ancestry offered no protection against the conditions of their own lives. Nearly 2 million years of previous survival could not guarantee one more successful generation. This is the quiet meaning of disappearance in evolution. A lineage can endure through climates and continents, yet its end may arrive through local pressures accumulating until births no longer replace deaths. Ngandong stands near that narrowing edge, where the latest bones known to science preserve presence while withholding the exact sequence that followed. The record fades rather than closes, leaving us with a final known population and an uncertain distance between its death and the true disappearance of Homo erectus. Undiscovered communities may have continued briefly beyond the horizon preserved by the Solo River deposits. Extinction rarely arrives through one cause acting alone, and the disappearance of Homo erectus is no exception. The latest known fossils from Ngandong belong to a population living on Java after many related populations elsewhere had already vanished, changed, or become difficult to distinguish from later human forms. By that time, the environments supporting Javanese Homo erectus were also changing. Evidence from animal communities and ancient habitats suggests that open woodland and grassland resources declined as wetter forests expanded across parts of Southeast Asia. Large grazing animals became less common, and the food webs used by populations adapted to more open settings may have narrowed. This environmental shift offers a plausible pressure, but it cannot be turned into a complete explanation. Forests did not advance everywhere at once. Homo erectus had survived earlier climatic changes, and fossils cannot show which missing resource became decisive for the final groups. Population structure may have been equally important. Communities on Java could become isolated when rising seas covered land on the Sunda Shelf, while shrinking suitable habitat may have divided them even before coastlines changed. Small populations lose resilience because a few deaths, poor birth years, injuries, disease events, or shortages of reproductive partners can alter their future more sharply than the same losses would affect a larger network. Isolation can also reduce the movement of useful knowledge and biological variation between groups. None of these processes leaves a clear signature saying that extinction began on a particular day. They accumulate quietly until recovery after ordinary losses becomes less likely. Other human lineages were also present across Asia during the later history of Homo erectus, including populations related to Denisovans and eventually Homo sapiens, but their relationships remain uncertain. Overlapping dates across a broad region do not prove direct meetings at Ngandong, and there is no secure evidence that modern humans hunted down or deliberately eliminated the last Homo erectus. Competition for food or habitat is possible where populations occupied nearby landscapes, yet possibility is not demonstration. Diseases, indirect ecological effects, avoidance, limited contact, or no contact at all could produce archaeological records that appear close in time. Even interbreeding cannot be assumed without genetic or other strong evidence, which has not been recovered for the Ngandong population. The human story near its origin was already formed by several hominin lineages sharing changing African landscapes, and its later Asian history remained similarly plural. One lineage did not automatically disappear whenever another arrived. Extinction could result when older vulnerabilities met new pressures within populations already reduced by geography and environmental change. Volcanic activity, river reorganization, floods, and shifts in rainfall may also have affected local survival, but no known eruption or disaster has been shown to erase Homo erectus in one final event. Sudden catastrophes are attractive because they create a visible ending. While demographic decline leaves only fewer sites and then silence, the evidence favors caution over drama. Homo erectus may have reached the boundary of an adaptive pattern that had worked across open and mixed environments for an extraordinary time, only to find that suitable habitats were contracting faster than isolated populations could adjust or reconnect. This would not mean they lacked intelligence or stopped adapting. Adaptation cannot create unlimited food, mates, time, or population size. Every lineage carries strengths shaped by earlier worlds, and those strengths can become insufficient when several conditions change together. The nearly 2 million year record therefore ends without one proven killer. Environmental transformation, isolation, small population size, competition, demographic chance, and perhaps factors not preserved in the ground may have combined differently in different places. The disappearance of Homo erectus was likely a long, uneven narrowing rather than a single defeat, reminding us that endurance can delay extinction for ages without ever making any human lineage permanent when the relationships among bodies, environments, knowledge, and generations no longer produce enough survivors to continue through another century. Homo erectus survived for nearly 2 million years without possessing one perfect body, one permanent habitat, or one invention that solved every danger. Its endurance emerged from several imperfect strengths working together across different places and generations. Long legs widened the distance that could be crossed, but greater movement required more food and water. Stone tools extended the hand, but only when useful rock, practiced skill, and social learning were available. Varied diets reduced dependence on one resource, but no diet prevented hunger when several sources failed together. Fire later offered warmth, light, protection, and new ways to process food. Yet it was unevenly used and could never replace water, fuel, or knowledge. Geographical spread separated populations and protected the wider lineage from some local disasters, while the same distance also produced isolation, small groups, lost skills, and local extinction. No single advantage was sufficient, and each carried a cost that had to be met again by every generation. the deepest answer lies not in dominance, but in repeated adequacy. Homo erectus did not need to control every landscape, only to find enough temporary places where children could grow, adults could obtain energy, and learned behavior could pass onward before its carriers died. The lineage began in changing African environments, expanded through corridors of water and life, and entered regions whose seasons, animals, plants, and stone demanded new adjustments. Some communities failed, others persisted, and no population understood that distant relatives were preserving the same broad human pattern elsewhere. What appears from our viewpoint as extraordinary continuity was made from countless ordinary recoveries after drought, injury, death, separation, and environmental change. This offers a useful lesson about evolution. Survival is not a prize awarded to the most intelligent species, the strongest body, or the richest technology. It is a temporary relationship between living populations and conditions that never remain still. Natural selection does not plan for distant centuries, and earlier success creates no promise of future survival. A trait can remain valuable for ages and become insufficient when climate, food, population size, or competition changes together. Homo erectus endured because variation allowed different populations to meet different problems. Culture allowed behavior to change faster than anatomy. Movement opened new opportunities, and social continuity rebuilt practical knowledge inside younger lives. Eventually, those supports narrowed, especially in late isolated populations, and the record faded without revealing one final cause. Their disappearance should not be treated as failure after a long victory, because extinction is part of the branching history that produced every living species, including our own. Homo sapiens inherited neither the exact body nor the exact world of Homo erectus, yet we remain dependent on the same foundations of water, food, climate, cooperation, childhood, and knowledge passed between generations. Modern technology has expanded our power, but it has also connected distant societies so closely that disturbances can spread far beyond one valley or coast. Our archives preserve more information than any earlier human lineage could hold. Yet information has value only when people use it to recognize limits, reduce avoidable harm, and adjust before familiar systems fail. Their story also teaches resilience depends on diversity, memory, and room for communities to recover after losses that cannot be prevented. The educational meaning of Homo erectus is therefore quiet rather than triumphant. Endurance grew from flexibility joined to continuity, from changing without losing every useful foundation, and from surviving locally without becoming independent of the wider living world. Nearly 2 million years do not reveal a secret that can be copied, but they remind us that lasting existence is built through repeated care for the conditions that allow another generation to begin. After seeing how long a simpler human lineage endured without believing itself master of Earth, the unanswered question is whether our own species, surrounded by knowledge and power, can remain adaptable for as long as the humans who walked before us.